My name is June, and I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a registered nurse at Mercy General in Columbus, Ohio. I raised 2 children, buried a husband who loved me right, and thought by the time I hit my 60s, I'd seen every hard thing life had to offer. I was wrong. What I'm about to tell you happened 4 years ago when I was 59, and I still think about it every single day, not because of the pain, though there was plenty of that, but because of how close I came to never telling this story at all. How close my granddaughter came to never taking her first breath. I need you to understand something before I start. I was a nurse for 3 decades. I've held the hands of domestic violence victims in the ER. I've photographed bruises for police reports. I've whispered to women in hospital beds, "You don't have to go back." I knew the signs. I taught other nurses how to spot them, and I still didn't see it happening to me. That's the part I need you to hear, especially if you're someone who thinks abuse only happens to a certain kind of woman, the uneducated woman, the woman with no options, the woman who doesn't know any better, because I knew better than almost anyone, and it still happened to me in my own kitchen, in my own house on a Tuesday afternoon in November. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it really started. I met my second husband, Robert, 2 years after I lost my first husband, Donald, to a heart attack. Donald was a good man, a quiet man. He fixed things around the house on weekends and called me June Bug until the day he died. Losing him at 54 was the kind of grief I didn't think I'd survive. Robert came into my life at a church fundraiser. He was 61, recently retired from 30 years in commercial real estate, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, the kind of man who knew how to walk into a room. He was charming in the way that certain men are, the kind of charming that feels like sunlight at first, warm and golden, and you don't notice that it's slowly burning you until you're already scorched. He pursued me with what I thought was tenderness. Flowers left on my porch, long phone calls that lasted past midnight. He remembered every small thing I mentioned, my daughter's college major, my favorite brand of coffee, the street where I grew up in Dayton. I told my daughter, Amy, that he paid attention the way Donald had. She was happy for me. We were married 11 months after we met. My friends thought I moved fast. Maybe they were right. But I was 56 years old. I wasn't interested in playing games. The first year was good. Mostly good. Mostly good. There were moments. Small moments I filed away and then forgot, where something felt slightly off. He didn't like when I made plans without telling him first. Not in an angry way, not at the beginning, just a tightness around his mouth, a quietness that lasted a few hours. I'd learned to check in before committing to anything, and I told myself that was just what marriage required. Consideration, communication. His daughter Naomi was another story. She was 37, divorced, with 2 school-age boys. She called her father every day, sometimes twice. She made no effort to hide her opinion that I was a replacement, a stand-in, someone who had wandered into a role I hadn't earned. She made little comments at family dinners about how her father used to eat before I changed everything, about how the house was different now. She never said anything outright cruel, nothing I could point to and call wrong, but it accumulated, it settled into my bones like damp cold. Robert always laughed it off. "That's just how she is," he'd say. "She's protective. You know how daughters are." He expected me to absorb it the way you absorb bad weather. Just put on a coat and keep moving. When my younger daughter Tess announced she was pregnant with her first child, I was over the moon. Tess was 34, a physical therapist in Cincinnati, married to a good steady man named Frank. They'd been trying for 2 years. The pregnancy was planned, wanted, celebrated. I drove down to Cincinnati the weekend they told me, and we sat in their backyard and cried happy tears and talked about names. I started knitting. I bought things, soft things, yellow and white, because they didn't know the sex yet. I set up a little corner in our guest room, stacked everything neatly, made it a project. This was going to be my first grandchild. After everything I'd lost. After Donald. After the years of feeling like the ground had shifted permanently under my feet. This baby felt like something solid to hold on to. That's when things with Naomi got worse. I think she couldn't stand that my attention had shifted, that I had something that filled me up in a way that had nothing to do with her father, nothing to do with trying to fit into their family. She started dropping by unannounced. She'd rearrange things in the kitchen, put dishes back in the wrong cabinets, move my spice rack, replace the hand soap in the guest bathroom with a brand she preferred, small territorial things that Robert thought I was crazy to notice. "She's trying to help," he'd say. The week before Thanksgiving, Naomi decided she was coming to stay with us for 5 days. I didn't want her there. Every cell in my body said no, but Robert insisted, said she was going through a hard time, said her boys needed stability, said it would mean everything to him if I could just be welcoming. And because I loved him, because I was still trying to make the marriage work, because I kept telling myself I was overreacting, I agreed. I cleaned that house from corner to corner. I made up the guest room and the room for her boys. I planned meals around her preferences, bought the specific brand of orange juice her boys liked, stocked up on the coffee Robert said she loved. I was going to be gracious if it killed me. She arrived on a Sunday, blew in like weather, kissed her father for a long time and then looked around my house the way a building inspector looks at a foundation, searching for problems. By Monday afternoon, she'd reorganized my linen closet. By Tuesday, she'd removed the framed photos of my grandchildren-to-be's sonogram from the refrigerator, taken them down and put them in a drawer, just set them aside like they were clutter. I found them when I was looking for a takeout menu, just sitting there in the junk drawer, face down. Something broke open in me when I saw that. It was such a small thing and such an enormous thing at the same time. This was my daughter's baby, my first grandchild. Those photos had been on that refrigerator since October, and this woman had walked into my home and put them in a drawer like they were nothing. I took a breath. I walked to the living room where Naomi was sitting with her coffee, watching something on her phone. I kept my voice as level as I could. I said, "Naomi, I found the ultrasound pictures in the junk drawer. I'd like to put them back where they were. Those are important to me." She looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as satisfied, like she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. She said, "I was just trying to make the space feel less cluttered. But if you need to hang up every little piece of paper on your refrigerator, go ahead." I said, "They're not pieces of paper. They're photographs of my grandchild," she said. "I'm just saying, the kitchen looked better without them." I stood there for a moment, something rising in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. I'm a 60-year-old woman with 31 years of professional experience handling crises. I know how to stay calm, but I was also a grandmother who had just found her grandbaby's first photograph stuffed in a drawer by a woman who had no right to touch anything in my home. I said quietly and clearly, "This is my house. Please don't move my things without asking me." That was it. That was all I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call her names. I didn't threaten her. I stated a fact. You'd have thought I'd thrown a glass at her. She went immediately to her father's study, where Robert was on a call with his old business partner. I heard her voice through the door, not the words, but the tone. Urgent. Injured. I stood in the hallway with those 2 ultrasound photos in my hand and felt the dread gathering in my stomach like a storm front. Robert came out of his study 10 minutes later. I had been in the marriage long enough by then to know his moods by the set of his jaw. And the jaw I saw walking down that hallway toward me was not the jaw of my husband, coming to hear my side of things. It was the jaw of a man who had already decided. He said, "What did you say to her?" I said, "I asked her not to move my things." He said, "She's a guest in this house." I said, "She's a guest who put Tessa's ultrasound photos in the junk drawer." Something changed in his face. I'd seen that change once or twice before, a flash of something dark quickly covered. But this time it didn't get covered. He said, "You need to apologize to her. She came here to help, and you embarrassed her." I said, "I asked her politely not to move my belongings. That's not something I need to apologize for." He grabbed my arm, not gently, not as a gesture. He grabbed it the way you grab something you're trying to stop from falling, hard, with intention. His fingers closed around my wrist, and he pulled me close to him and said very quietly, "You will go in there and apologize to my daughter." I looked at him, this man I'd married, this silver-haired man who'd left flowers on my porch. I said, "Robert, you're hurting me. Let go of my arm." He didn't let go. He said, "I'm done watching you make her feel unwelcome. I'm done defending you to my family. You are difficult, June. You have always been difficult, and I am tired of it." I tried to pull away. He shoved me. I wasn't expecting it. I was 60 years old with a bad right knee from years of 12-hour shifts on hospital floors. I went down hard, sideways, catching my hip on the edge of the kitchen island on the way down. The sound I made when I hit the floor was not dignified. It was the sound of a body absorbing sudden impact. I lay there for a moment too stunned to speak, and then he was standing over me. And his voice was different now, and he said things. I won't repeat all of them. Some of them were about my worth as a wife. Some of them were about my worth as a wife. Some of them were about my dead first husband. Some of them were things I still hear sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. Naomi appeared in the kitchen doorway. I looked at her from the floor, waiting for her to say something, to intervene, to show one shred of human decency. She looked at me, then at her father. Then she turned and walked back down the hall. She left me there. I don't know how long I was on the floor. Long enough to understand that something in my hip was badly wrong. Long enough for the shock to start converting to pain. Long enough to hear Naomi on her phone in the other room, her voice low. Robert had walked out to the garage. I could hear the door, the familiar groan of it. I pulled myself up using the kitchen island. My hip screamed. I grabbed the counter and stood there breathing, and then I did the thing I tell every woman in that situation to do. I called 911. I sat back down on the floor before the dispatcher picked up, because standing hurt too much. I told him my name and my address, and I said, "I've been assaulted by my husband. I'm 60 years old and I think I may have fractured my hip. Please send someone." The dispatcher stayed on with me. She was good, calm and steady, and she kept me talking. She asked if my husband was still in the house. I said I thought he was in the garage. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Robert came back inside when he heard the sirens. His face went through 3 expressions in about 4 seconds: shock, calculation, then the smooth mask of concern. He crouched beside me and said, "June, what happened? Are you okay?" Like he didn't know, like he hadn't just stood over me and said the things he said. The paramedics came in and Robert immediately began his version of events. He said I'd tripped, said the kitchen floor was slippery, said I'd fallen trying to reach something in the upper cabinet. He said it with the ease of someone who'd told a story before, not a specific story, but this kind of story, one where he was not responsible. I looked at one of the paramedics, a young woman, couldn't have been more than 28, and I watched her look at me and then look at Robert and then look at me again. I said nothing to contradict him, not then. I was in pain, I was in shock, and Robert was standing right there with his hand on my shoulder, and every part of me understood what it meant that his hand was on my shoulder. It was not comfort. It was a reminder. The hospital was St. Anthony's, 12 minutes away. Robert rode in the ambulance with me. He held my hand, he smoothed my hair. He told the paramedics about my nursing career, said I'd worked on my feet for 30 years and my joints had never been great. He was painting a picture very efficiently, and he'd had about 12 minutes to do it. They brought me into the ER, and the pain was becoming harder to manage, and I was trying to hold everything together and keep thinking clearly. And Robert was right there, right at my elbow at every station, answering questions before I could. They took me for imaging. Robert waited in the hallway. I lay in that CT scanner and I thought about Tess, and I thought about Donald, and I thought about those ultrasound pictures in the drawer, and I thought, if you don't say something, you are going back to that house with him tonight. I thought about every woman I'd ever seen in an ER bed with a story that didn't add up. When they brought me back to my room, the on-call orthopedic resident confirmed what I suspected: non-displaced fracture of the greater trochanter, the hip bone. Not a surgical fracture, thank God, but serious. I would be on a walker for 6 weeks. I would need help at home. The resident stepped out and a nurse came in to do my intake assessment. Her name tag said Wanda. She was maybe 55, a black woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and the particular no-nonsense energy of someone who had been doing this work for a long time. The kind of nurse I had been. She started asking me questions, routine things, medical history, medications, allergies. She asked about my pain level. She helped me with the gown, and then she got very quiet for a moment, looking at something on my arm. She said, "Mrs. Halliday, can I ask you how you got this bruising on your forearm?" I said I fell. She wrote something down. She asked me to show her where else I hurt. I told her my hip, my shoulder. She looked at the shoulder. She was quiet again. She said, "I'm going to ask you something and I want you to take a breath before you answer." She lowered her clipboard and she looked at me directly. She said, "Is your husband in this hospital right now?" I said, "Yes." She nodded like that answer told her something. She said, "Okay, I'm going to need you to bear with me for just a minute." She walked to the door, looked out into the hall. She came back and sat down in the chair beside my bed. Not at the foot of the bed, not standing above me, but right at eye level, the way you sit with someone when you want them to understand that you're on their side. She said, "I've been a nurse for 27 years. I've worked this ER for 19 of them. I know what a fall looks like and I know what a fall doesn't look like." She paused. "The bruising on your forearm is in the shape of a grip. It's not a fall bruise, and the fracture you have is consistent with a lateral impact, not a downward fall. A straight fall, even a bad one, doesn't typically cause that pattern." I looked at her. She said, "I'm not going to push you to say anything right now, but I want you to know something." She leaned forward slightly. Under Ohio law, when a patient presents with injuries that raise reasonable suspicion of domestic violence, I am required to document everything I observe, every bruise, every pattern, the location and shape of every mark. That documentation goes into your permanent medical record. She paused again. "And I want your husband to know that I've already started doing that. So if he's out in that hallway with any ideas about how this is going to go, he should understand that the documentation process is already underway and it cannot be undone." She stood up, straightened her clipboard. She said, "I'm going to go let him know that we'll need a few more minutes in here for the full assessment. Hospital protocol for fracture patients." She said it like it was routine. "He'll need to wait in the family waiting area down the hall." She walked out. I lay there in that bed and I heard her voice in the hallway, polite and professional and iron underneath, saying something to Robert about hospital procedure, about the assessment process, about waiting areas. I heard Robert's voice. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew the tone, the controlled one, the polished one. And then I heard his footsteps going away down the hall. Wanda came back in and closed the door. She sat back down. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with those steady eyes, and the dam broke. I'm a 60-year-old woman who held it together through Donald's death, through moving, through grief that felt like a physical weight I carried in my chest for 2 years. I am not a woman who falls apart easily. I fell apart. I told her everything, the grab, the fall, the things he said, Naomi standing in the doorway and walking away. I told her about the slow accumulation of the last 3 years, The checking in, the tightness, the way I'd learned to read his moods and manage around them. I told her I was a nurse, that I'd spent decades telling other women to leave, and I hadn't even seen what was happening to me until I was on my own kitchen floor. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she handed me a box of tissues and she said, "What happened to you is not a reflection of your intelligence or your experience. It is a reflection of who he is." She called the patient advocate. She called the hospital's social worker, a young man named Dale, who looked about 25, but turned out to be sharper than he appeared. She had hospital security stationed outside my room within 15 minutes. Dale walked me through my options with the quiet practicality of someone who had these conversations often. He told me about the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. He told me about emergency protective orders and how quickly they could be processed in Franklin County. He told me that given my injury and age, I had significant standing and that the documentation Wanda had already begun was meaningful. I called Amy, my older daughter, from the hospital room. When she picked up and heard my voice, she said, "Mum, what's wrong?" Not a question. She already knew. I told her. She was on the highway to Columbus within 20 minutes. When she walked into that hospital room and saw me in the bed with the walker leaning against the wall and the bruising on my arm, she put her hand over her mouth. Then she took it away and she said, "Okay, you're never going back to that house. Tell me what you need." Robert was in the family waiting area for over an hour. By the time a hospital security officer and a Columbus PD officer went to speak with him, Dale had already documented my formal statement. The officer who came to my room was a woman in her 40s, direct and efficient, who told me that based on what I'd said and what Wanda had documented, they had sufficient grounds to pursue charges. Robert was not arrested that night. I want to be honest about that, because this story doesn't have the clean snap of handcuffs clicking in a hospital hallway. What happened was slower and uglier and more complicated. He was escorted from the property and informed that he could not return to the house pending investigation. He called me 3 times from the parking lot. I didn't answer. I stayed in the hospital for 2 nights. Tess drove up from Cincinnati 8 months pregnant, stomach like a beach ball, furious in the way that only a daughter can be furious on behalf of her mother. She sat on the edge of my hospital bed and held my hand and said, "Mom, how long?" And I told her the truth, which was that I hadn't wanted to see it. She said I saw it, I just didn't know what to say. That broke my heart in a specific way, that my daughter had been watching and worrying and carrying that alone. The legal process was exhausting in the way all slow-grinding institutional processes are exhausting. I filed for a civil protection order, which was granted within 48 hours. The prosecutor reviewed the case and ultimately charged Robert with domestic violence under Ohio Revised Code 2919.25, a first-degree misdemeanor that carries real weight for someone with no prior record, especially when the victim is a senior citizen, which adds enhanced penalties under Ohio law. His attorney pushed for diversion. I said no. He pleaded guilty 6 months later, on the advice of his own attorney, once they saw Wanda's documentation, the photographs, my statement, Dale's case file, and a supplementary statement from the Columbus officer who'd responded. The bruising pattern on my forearm had been photographed from 5 different angles. The fracture record spoke for itself. He received 1 year of probation, mandatory domestic violence counseling, community service hours, and a permanent civil protection order requiring him to stay away from me and, importantly, from my daughter Tess and her family. Naomi tried to call me 4 times in the weeks after. I never answered. My attorney advised me there was a path to hold her accountable for witnessing the assault and failing to render aid, a more complicated legal argument, but I decided I didn't have the energy to pursue it. What I knew was that she had stood in that doorway and walked away, and she would have to live with that. I moved back into the house. My name was on the deed, bought with my own savings from 31 years of nursing, and Tess moved in with me for the last month of her pregnancy. We set up her old bedroom with a birthing bag and a bassinet, and we watched old movies, and I taught her how to freeze meals for the first weeks home, and we didn't talk about Robert unless she brought him up. My granddaughter was born on a Thursday morning in January, 6 pounds, 14 ounces. They let me be in the room because Tess wanted her mother there, and when they put that baby in my arms for the first time, I understood in a new way what it means to be grateful for ordinary life, for being alive and present and in one piece, for having not let the last chapter of this story be written the way he would have written it. Her name is June, my granddaughter's name. Tess named her that without telling me she was going to, and when she said it, I had to leave the room for a few minutes because I couldn't hold my face together. The healing was not linear, and it wasn't pretty. I had nightmares. I had days where the phone would ring and my heart would slam against my ribs before I registered that it wasn't him. I had moments in the grocery store, reaching for something on a high shelf where I would feel a hand that wasn't there and have to put both palms flat on the cart and breathe. My hip healed. It took 12 weeks, not 6, because I'm 60, and bodies are honest at this age. I did physical therapy 3 times a week with a woman who didn't know my story and didn't need to, who just counted my repetitions and told me I was stronger than I thought. I went back to church. I told my pastor the truth, which I'd been afraid to do because Robert and I had attended together, and I didn't know how it would land. She took my hands across the desk in her office and said, "June, we are so glad you're here." That's all she said. It was enough. I reconnected with colleagues from my nursing years, women I'd let drift when Robert took up all the space. We had dinner, we talked. I remembered who I was before him, the thing nobody tells you about leaving an abusive relationship when you're older. When you're in your 60s and you've already lived most of your life and you thought the hard chapters were behind you, is the particular shame of it. Not just the shame of having been a victim, which is its own heavy thing, but the shame of thinking, I am too old and too experienced for this to have happened to me. I should have known. I did know. I spent a lot of time with that shame. I sat with it and I looked at it, and eventually I understood that it was just another form of the lie he told, that this was my failure. It wasn't. He was careful and he was practiced, and he knew exactly how to move slowly enough that each step felt normal until you were standing somewhere you never intended to go. About 8 months after the incident, I got a message through the hospital's patient services system from Wanda. She said she'd heard I was doing well and she was glad. She asked if I'd be willing to have coffee sometime. I said yes. Of course I said yes. We met at a diner near St. Anthony's on a Saturday morning. She was in civilian clothes and looked smaller than she had in the ER, which is always strange when you see medical people outside their context. We ordered eggs and coffee, and she told me she'd thought about me a lot. She said she'd been in that job for 19 years, and she'd seen a lot of patients come through, and I wasn't the first woman she'd had that conversation with, but something about my case had stayed with her. I told her what I'd told my daughters, what I'd told my therapist, what I told my support group, that what she did saved me. Not just in the procedural sense, in the sense that she looked at me and said, without any drama or fanfare, I see what's happening here and I'm going to handle it. She hadn't waited for me to ask. She hadn't tiptoed. She'd acted. I asked her about what she'd said to Robert, about the documentation being already underway, already in the system, unable to be undone. She smiled into her coffee cup. She said, the documentation was real. The photographs were real. What I may have slightly exaggerated was the timeline of how immediately it reaches outside agencies. Documentation becomes part of your medical record immediately, yes. Whether it triggers an automatic referral at that exact moment depends on the specifics. What I needed him to believe was that the train had already left the station, that there was nothing he could do in that hallway or in that parking lot that would change what had already been set in motion. She paused. She said, he struck me as the kind of man who always thinks there's a lever to pull. I needed to make sure he believed there was no lever. I looked at this woman across the table, This quiet, bespectacled, utterly ordinary-looking woman, and I thought about what a particular kind of bravery it takes to know exactly what to say to a dangerous person and then say it calmly in a hospital hallway between writing notes on a clipboard. We have lunch every few months now. She met little June at 6 weeks old and held her with the practiced ease of someone who has handled new humans before. She said, "She's going to be something." I told her she already is. I started speaking publicly about what happened to me about a year after the fact. I was asked by a local organization to address a fundraising luncheon. They knew my background in nursing. They thought I might speak to the healthcare side of domestic violence. I had not planned to share my own story. But I got up at that podium and I looked out at the room. 100 and some women, various ages, nice clothes, good jewelry. And I thought about how many of them might be sitting in something they couldn't yet name. How many of them might be the woman I was 3 years ago, explaining away the small things. I told them the truth, the whole thing. When I finished, the room was very quiet. And then a woman in the third row raised her hand and said, "I'm a retired attorney. I'd been covering bruises with makeup for 2 years. I didn't know there was a name for what was happening. And we sat with that together for a long moment, and then I gave her Dale's number. I'm telling you my story now for the same reason I tell it, anywhere I tell it. Because if you're watching this from somewhere comfortable, thinking this particular thing could never happen to you, I want you to understand that I was 60 years old with 3 decades of professional experience identifying exactly this, and it happened to me. Abuse does not care what you know. It does not care how old you are or how educated you are or how much you've already survived. And if you're watching this because something in what I'm describing sounds familiar, a grab that was explained away, a shove that was called an accident, a door that seems to be closing slowly around you, I want you to hear me clearly. That voice in your gut that says something is wrong, it is not overreacting. It is correct. It has always been correct. The voice in your gut is the most sophisticated instrument you own, and it is telling you the truth. There are people who will help you. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-723. They are there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If calling feels impossible, you can text SART to 88888, or you can chat with them online. If you're older, if you're a senior, the Elder Care Locator at 1-800-677-1116 can connect you with resources specifically designed for older adults experiencing abuse, because yes, it happens to us too, and there are people who understand that. Don't wait until you're on a hospital floor. Don't wait until the thing that seems small becomes the thing you cannot walk away from. Make one call. Send one text. Tell one person the truth. I'm 63 years old. My hip works fine. My granddaughter calls me Grandma June, and she runs to me when I walk in the door. I am happy. I am safe. I am, against the odds of the worst year of my life, genuinely okay. And if you're sitting somewhere right now feeling like okay is impossible from where you are, I want you to know I thought so too. I was on my kitchen floor thinking so. I was wrong. Please, like this video if it meant something to you. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. And drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if this reached you. I read every single one. And every comment, every share, every person who passes this along to someone who needs it. You're part of how these stories travel to the people who need them most. You are not alone. I promise you that. I used to think that what you know protects you. 31 years as a nurse, 31 years of watching how things go wrong, of learning the patterns, of telling other women what I'm now telling you, and still I ended up on my own kitchen floor. I'd had a lot of time to sit with that, to figure out what it means. Here's what I've come to understand. Knowledge without honesty is just decoration. I had all the information I needed. I had it years before that Tuesday in November. What I didn't have was the willingness to be honest with myself about what I was seeing. Every time something felt wrong. The grip on my arm that was a little too firm, the silences that lasted a little too long, the way Naomi could walk through my house like she owned it, and Robert would just nod. I filed it away. I told myself I was being sensitive, dramatic, difficult. He told me I was difficult. And some part of me believed it, and that belief was the thing that kept me there. That's the first thing I'd want anyone to take from this. The most dangerous lie isn't the one someone else tells you. It's the one you agreed to tell yourself. Robert didn't keep me in that marriage with force, not for the first 3 years. He kept me there with a version of events that I was willing to accept because accepting it was easier than facing what it meant. The moment I stopped accepting it on the floor, calling 911, was the moment things began to change. The second thing is about Wanda. I think about her often. This quiet, steady woman who sat down at eye level with me and spoke the truth plainly. She didn't rescue me in a dramatic sense. She didn't burst through a door. She just did her job with complete integrity and said, clearly, I see what's happening and I am going to document it, and he should know that. That was it. And it was everything. I've spent a long time thinking about what made her effective where others might have hesitated. And I think it comes down to this. She had decided at some point in her career that her job was to tell the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. That decision, made in the abstract, long before I ever walked into her ER, is what saved me that night. The choices we make about who we're going to be before the hard moment arrives are the ones that matter most when the hard moment comes. And then there's the question of what comes after. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry. I am, but the anger has changed shape. In the beginning, it was hot and blinding, and I wanted Robert to suffer in specific, measurable ways. Now it's quieter, more like clarity than heat. He made choices that cost him a great deal. His marriage, his reputation in the community we shared, the chance to be a grandfather to little June. Not because I punished him. Because his choices had weight, and weight falls where it lands. What I built after is mine. The hip healed. My daughter came home. My granddaughter runs to me across the living room with her arms out, and she doesn't know any of this story yet, and she doesn't need to. All she needs to know right now is that her grandmother shows up. And I do. I always will. That's what's on the other side of the hardest thing. Not perfection. Not a life without scars, just the profound, quiet satisfaction of still being here, of having told the truth when it cost something, of being finally exactly who you always were before someone spent 3 years trying to convince you that you weren't.